As video games developed, so too did the thrill of acquiring each game's ultimate weapon. In the case of Final Fantasy, this saw the acquisition of ultimate weapons transform from simply being found in a chest deep within the game's final dungeon through to needing to beat super bosses or undergo some pretty severe challenges. The nature of super bosses also changed, adapting in tandem with each game's story. From Final Fantasy VII onwards, this meant every named character was given their own ultimate weapon, as a way of ensuring that each of them had the chance to be the star of the show, not just the game's quote-unquote main protagonist. But in spite of that, the notion that not all ultimate weapons were equal persisted, something that was typified by Final Fantasy IX, where the game's strongest weapon could be wielded by Steiner. On the surface, that may seem strange, but those who watched part 1 of this series will understand that it makes perfect sense. This video will serve as the second episode in this multi-part series that will continue to explore, we hope, every single ultimate weapon, or at least classification of ultimate weapon, to have been associated with the Final Fantasy franchise in chronological order. And as we dive into Final Fantasy X and its infamous celestial weapons, who knows, maybe we'll even see some new traits emerge. So with that in mind, we encourage you to sit back and relax as we continue to explore the complete evolution of ultimate weapons. Final Fantasy X represented another huge shift for the franchise. It featured a fresh new aesthetic and thematic backdrop that was inspired by Asian culture. The sphere grid was used to create subtle allusions to previous jobs, while simultaneously allowing for more character customization than any previous game except for Final Fantasy II, and weapons were treated in a manner that had never been seen before. In every prior game, weapons had always been given independent attributes that helped to enhance whatever attributes the character had. Within the earliest games, weapons had purposeful damage attributes, but they also influenced hit percentage, critical chance, and even character evasion. Final Fantasy VIII represented the first game where the damage components of individual weapons weren't all that important, but hit rate was still very much a thing. Final Fantasy X did away with all of that. Weapons no longer had an innate impact on chance to strike, evasion, or the probability of a strike dealing critical damage. They also did not come with individual damage attributes, and this was a first for the franchise. It meant there was no de facto ultimate weapon based on raw strength alone. But there were ultimate weapons, and they were very clearly defined. Every character had their own celestial weapon, but to even attempt acquiring any of them, players first needed to obtain the Celestial Mirror, which was only possible if they found their way to Remium Temple, beat the Chocobo to obtain the Cloudy Mirror, and then solved the quest in Macalania Temple that was related to finding a missing sun. Even then, once the mirror was upgraded, every celestial weapon had its own challenge associated with it. For example, to obtain the Khaled Bowl, which was called Ultima Weapon in almost every non-English version of the game, players had to visit the Calmlands and beat the Catch a Chocobo race. Then, head to a part of the Calmlands that was previously inaccessible because a man was blocking the path, and interact with the altar that could be found there. Other weapons, such as the God Hand and the Masamune, simply needed to be found, although there was still some mystery involved, as one needed a secret password to be entered on the airship, and the other required the player knowing what to do with the rusty sword once they found it outside of the Cavern of the Stolen Faith. But just obtaining these weapons was not enough, as they were inferior to many of the other weapons players had access to. This then harkened back to the Onion Sword from Final Fantasy III, because the celestial weapons were not pick up and play. Acquiring them was just the first step in a much longer journey. Each weapon had two potential upgrades, with the first requiring the player to find the associated crest, and the second requiring them to find the associated sigil. The crests were often just found throughout the world, but the sigils required a lot more effort. The Sun Sigil, for example, required players to not just go back and beat the Catch a Chocobo race again, but finish with a low enough time, while the Venus or Mars Sigil, depending on which version of the game was being played, required players to head to the Thunder Plains and dodge 200 consecutive lightning bolts. It was only once the weapon had been obtained, along with the associated crest and sigil, that the initial weapon could be upgraded to its ultimate form, but the results varied from character to character. Due to how Final Fantasy X worked, weapons were vessels for auto abilities, and this meant every character gained access to break damage limit, but other passives included triple overdrive, counter strike, double AP, and 1 MP cost. This meant wielding the celestial weapons was a severe upgrade on almost every other weapon in the game, but due to the nature of the game, players could also attempt to build their own ultimate weapons. After progressing to a certain point, players gained access to the ability to craft their own weapons. They just needed to make sure the weapon had free slots and that they had the appropriate items required for the customization. Break damage limit, for example, could be added to a weapon by spending 60 dark matter, whereas triple overdrive cost 30 winning formula. Due to the nature of this aspect of the game, it has led to many people creating what they deem to be superior ultimate weapons for each character, with one caveat. The celestial weapons had ignore defense built in as a hidden auto ability, whereas regular weapons did not. Piercing therefore needed to take up one of the slots, but players could, for example, use Tidus's Excalibur as a base as it came with the break damage limit innately, before adding piercing, triple overdrive, and something like first strike. Final Fantasy X-2 then took these notions much further, as there were no weapons, at least in the traditional sense. The weapon used by each character was now determined by the equipped Dressphere, and this meant there were again no ultimate weapons in the traditional sense, as there were no individual weapons. But that didn't mean the concept of something offensive boosting attributes beyond expected norms didn't exist, and in that regard, there were two possibilities. The first came via the special Dresspheres. These were unique to each character, akin to the ultimate weapons seen in the numbered Final Fantasy games from 7 onward, and similar to Final Fantasy X, they granted the character unique support abilities, but also unique command abilities too. Two of them needed to be found, while Full Throttle could only be obtained by talking to Trommel 4 times. Each enhanced a character's innate attributes, and they also served as one of the routes available for them to obtain the break damage limit auto ability. But just like in Final Fantasy X, this required players to upgrade the associated special Dressphere. The other high-powered Dressphere was Mascot. In the original version of the game, obtaining Mascot required players to have near-perfect story completion, as it only became available once episode complete had been accomplished in every location. What made it so powerful was that it provided a significant boost to each character's attributes across the board, as opposed to most Dresspheres that specialised in one or two areas. Now, the default version of Final Fantasy XI brought with it many concepts that would later become more solidified. This meant there was a strong selection of jobs and advanced jobs, and each weapon category had a plethora of options available for players to choose from as they sought to maximise the effectiveness of their characters. But following the launch of the game's first expansion, Rize of the Zilart, everything started to change. New areas were introduced, alongside a new main story quest, and 3 advanced jobs were added to the existing lineup. But so too were new gameplay systems, such as a PvP mode called Ballista and Dynamis. And it was the latter system that had a profound impact on weapons. When venturing into the 4 initial areas of Dynamis, Bastok, Sandoria, Windurst, and Juno, relic weapons could be dropped at random by enemies found within. There was a weapon for every major category, but as per the new trend, these initial relic weapons were quite useless, as the majority did the minimum damage possible and had the maximum delay. Due to the nature of Final Fantasy XI as an MMO, the quest to unlock the power of these relic weapons was far more complicated than what was even seen in Final Fantasy X, as specific items needed to be obtained and a big fee needed to be paid. But the items weren't always easy to obtain, as they either needed to be found directly in Dynamis or crafted based on materials obtained in Dynamis, which required someone with the correct crafting skill at the appropriate level, and the fee was also in a Dynamis-specific currency. Each stage required more items and a higher fee, and if this was satisfied, then the associated relic weapon started to gain its power. Using the Relic Sword as an example, if Stage 2 was complete, then the Relic Sword transformed into the Glyptic Sword, and some of its stats started to become available, but only when used in Dynamis. At Stage 3, the Glyptic Sword became the Dynamis Sword, The Dynamis only stats became available outside of Dynamis, and a new, higher threshold of Dynamis only stats were introduced. At stage 4, the Dynamis sword became the Caliburn. Its stats were now slightly higher than the best case scenario for the Dynamis sword, and they were also made available anywhere. But the weapon's ultimate weapon skill, in this case the Knights of the Round, became available, but only when wielded inside Dynamis. At the 5th and final stage, the weapon had reached its peak. Caliburn became Excalibur, and its stats hit maximum, Knights of the Round could be used anywhere, and a powerful additional effect and hidden effect became available. When Rize of the Zilart launched, this process was designed to take a well-organised link shell months to obtain a single, complete relic weapon. This required a huge commitment from everyone involved, and a lot of trust and faith that the person who received the 5th stage weapon wasn't going to just up and leave and join another link shell, or quit the game. Around the same time that Final Fantasy XI was connecting players all around the world to tackle challenges together, another game called Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was launched with the mindset of connecting players locally, as if there was access to a GameCube, 4 Game Boy Advances, and 4 GameCube Game Boy Advance cables, and 3 friends that lived nearby, then couch co-op dungeon raiding became very much a thing. Harkening back to the original Final Fantasy, there was a limited number of classes available for players to choose from, but this time they were locked to specific races, and each race was only able to equip one type of weapon. Clavats, for example, wielded swords, while Lilties wielded spears. As the story progressed, new weapons could be crafted, but only if the crafting recipe had been found, specified materials had been gathered, and the blacksmith was of a high enough level. This then harkened back to the likes of Final Fantasy VIII and XI, both of which locked their ultimate weapons behind crafting and resource gathering. Each race was quite uniform in terms of weapon strength, with them all having near identical milestones, but there were a few deviations, and one of them led to one race having a weapon that was far more powerful than any of the others. And for the first time in the history of the franchise, this meant a game's ultimate weapon in terms of raw strength was not a sword. Even though Clavats had access to swords that adorn the names of Excalibur and Ragnarok, both were weaker than Longinus, a spear that could be wielded by Lilties. Unlike every other character, which saw the strength of their weapons cap out at 35, this saw Longinus go far beyond that to feature a strength of 40. It was also the most expensive weapon available in the game, through regular means at least, and it granted access to a unique focus attack called Bladestorm, which had the potential to hit 5 times for 3 extra damage per hit. On paper, this could make Lilties a wrecking ball, but there was a strong caveat, because Bladestorm could be interrupted. Crystal Chronicles though did also feature so-called Ultima weapons, which were designed to be the game's ultimate weapons. Each race had their own Ultima weapon, with the name Ultima serving as a prefix on the type of weapon they equipped. For example, Clavats could wield the Ultima sword, while Ukes used the Ultima hammer. Each had the joint second highest attack strength, and had a ridiculous cost in comparison to every other weapon available in the game, including Longinus. But the focus attack was not unique. That unique focus attack was often assigned to another weapon that had the same strength as the ultimate weapon. Clavats, for example, had the aforementioned Ragnarok, while Selkies had the Dreamcatcher. The discovery of the first ultimate weapons in the original Final Fantasy through to those obtainable in Crystal Chronicles showed just how far the concept had come. So when work commenced on a complete overhaul of the original Final Fantasy for the Game Boy Advance as part of the Dawn of Souls package, it made sense to evolve the notion of ultimate weapons to better reflect how things had changed over time, and to give existing players something new and exciting to work towards. This saw a suite of new weapons introduced that rivaled the likes of the Masamune and Excalibur, with many paying tribute to the past. But 3 in particular stood out, and they had an intimate relationship with the ultimate weapons from Final Fantasy VI. Lightbringer, which was dropped from the Death Gaze, itself an homage back to Final Fantasy VI, had the lowest raw strength of the 3. But this was deceptive, as just like in Final Fantasy VI, it offered +7 to all major attributes and +50 to evasion. Ragnarok, which was dropped by Shinryu, was then a slight step up in terms of raw power, but its attribute bonuses were not as strong. Both weapons also cast their respective spells of Holy and Flare when used as an item, And there were also job restrictions, with Lightbringer locked to red wizards and Ragnarok locked to knights. The strongest of the three though was Ultima weapon, which could be wielded by any upgraded job. As an ode to the Masamune from the original game, this could simply be found on the last floor of a new bonus dungeon called the Whisperwind Cove, and it started out with almost double the raw attack power of the Ragnarok, but as per Final Fantasy VI and VII, the Ultima weapon's power decreased in line with the wielder's current HP. The same approach was then taken for Final Fantasy II, which was also part of the Dawn of Souls package. It saw a selection of new weapons added, but there was one major difference. These new weapons were exclusive to the Soul of Rebirth, which was a bonus quest that focused on Minwu, Scott, and Joseph, and they were also exclusive to each character. This served as a complete departure from the original game, where any weapon was equipable by any character. And there was also another major shift, as amongst the three weapons available, Scott's sword, the Wild Rose, did not have the highest raw strength. That mantle was instead reserved for Richard's Wyvern Lance. Final Fantasy IV, at the time of release, had featured an evolved approach to tackling ultimate weapons. It placed more focus on characters as opposed to jobs. And because Cecil was the main protagonist, he was given the game's ultimate weapon, a holy sword called Ragnarok. But other characters were also given purposeful weapons, and the likes of Kain and Edge were given very strong weapons in their own right. For the advanced release, a similar approach was taken, but the method of acquisition was simplified. Within the Lunar Ruins, a new bonus dungeon, each character was given a purposeful trial they needed to complete, and the reward for completing the trial was a new ultimate weapon. This meant that whereas in the original game only a few characters had purposeful ultimate weapons that only they could wield, with the rest having to share amongst a group, now every character had their own powerful weapon that was exclusive to them. Amongst the selection, however, Cecil was still the character with the most powerful weapon in terms of raw attack, and this came via the Lightbringer, which, just like its Final Fantasy VI namesake, also had the potential to cast Holy when attacking. Final Fantasy XII featured a similar progression system to Final Fantasy X, but with the way the license board functioned, it was even more extreme, as it meant every character could equip every type of weapon. This was a huge change in comparison to every previous game that had featured named protagonists, with Final Fantasy II being the only previous game that offered as much freedom with how players ultimately built out their characters. As such, it meant every character in the game was eligible to wield the strongest weapon in the game, assuming it could even be obtained. The Zodiac Spear has become infamous due to the unreasonable requirements placed around its acquisition, as without a guide, it was near impossible to ever obtain. In the original PlayStation 2 release of the game, there were two methods available. They both involved chests, and they were both very cruel. The first method involved an array of 16 chests that could be found laid out in a grid inside the Necrol of Nabudis. The Zodiac Spear was located in a chest in the front row, and it was easy enough to just pick up. There were just a few caveats. To begin, there were 4 specific chests located throughout the world that the player was not allowed to open, because if any of them were opened, the Zodiac Spear disappeared from the chest in the Necrol. To make matters worse, if the chests weren't opened, the Zodiac Spear also disappeared from the Necrol if any player had a diamond armlet equipped when the chest was opened. That then brings us on to the second method, which required the acquisition of at least 10 espers and the completion of the Mind Flayer hunt. After completing these tasks and speaking to an NPC in Jahara, access was granted to the Hen Mines Phase 2 dig, and inside, the Zodiac Spear could be found inside a chest. Except, there was only a 10% chance of the chest ever spawning, a 10% chance of the chest containing something if it did spawn, and then a further 10% chance that the something inside the chest was the Zodiac Spear. In other words, there was only a 0.1% chance of the chest ever containing the item you wanted. And as if to rub salt in the wound, in complete contrast to the other method, this time the Zodiac Spear wouldn't appear if the player wasn't wearing a diamond armlet. Needless to say, obtaining either of the 2 Zodiac Spears was a mission, but the raw power of the weapon was by far superior to anything else in the game. The other method of acquiring some of the game's strongest weapons wasn't quite as convoluted, but it could end up being very time consuming, and that was because it involved the Bazaar. The idea behind the system was that the bazaar served as a special shop whereby selling certain items unlocked new items for purchase. This then created a labyrinth of potential items, and at the end of one specific path was the Tournesol, a very powerful greatsword. The major challenge was that 3 very rare items needed to be sold 3 times each, and this involved a pretty significant time investment. The other very powerful weapon that could be acquired through this method was the Masamune, but that was also a reward for the Gilgamesh hunt. By mid-2006, Final Fantasy XI was at its peak. Rise of the Zilart and Chains of Promathia had coincided with successful launches in North America and Europe, and the player base had settled at around 500,000 active subscriptions. Treasures of Urhgan, the game's third expansion, was designed to push the game even further, introducing a whole host of new activities like assaults and besieged, alongside 3 new jobs, new beastmen tribes, and some lavish new areas. By this point, some time had passed since Dynamis was introduced, but many people were still toiling away attempting to acquire their own relic weapons. That didn't stop the developers though from introducing a new type of ultimate weapon called Mythic weapons. In theory, the method of acquisition was mechanically similar, as an inferior weapon called Vigil weapons needed to be obtained and then upgraded, but almost everything else was different. Whereas not all relic weapons were specific to a particular job, with the Ragnarok for example able to be equipped by warriors, paladins and dark knights, mythic weapons were. This meant after obtaining the inferior weapon, which was no easy feat, players had to be level 75 or more in relation to the Vigil weapon they'd obtained, otherwise they'd be prohibited from undertaking the Unlocking the Myth quest. But that wasn't the only prerequisite. Players also had to have finished the expansion's main story quest, and be promoted to the mercenary rank of captain by completing all 50 of the assaults. They then had to go through a string of quests granted by Naja's assistant, such as slaying a selection of notorious monsters, including Odin, to ensure certain titles were obtained, completing all 50 assaults again, obtaining a ton of specific currency and items, beating a selection of Zenai notorious monsters, before then fighting against a powerful boss called Belran. Needless to say, these steps required a lot of time and patience, and the reward was good, but it was very much an alternative to the relics. The damage was comparable, but due to mythic weapons often being locked to specific jobs, they provided specific utility to make that job better. For example, the Burt Gang, which was the mythic weapon for paladins, had less damage and more delay than Excalibur, but it increased enmity and reduced physical damage taken, making tanking much more effective. When Final Fantasy III was remade for the Nintendo DS, the developers took advantage of the improved console specifications to enhance numerous aspects of the game's presentation, but they also added new enemies, new quests, and of course, new weapons. On paper, the Onion Sword, which saw its attack reduced from 200 to 156, was still the strongest weapon in the game in terms of raw attack power. But another weapon was created for the remake that was able to surpass its application in combat. One of the new side quests involved a character called the Legendary Smith, who roamed around the map. After acquiring the Invincible, players were able to try and hunt down a piece of Orichalcum. If they then brought it to the Legendary Smith, and they also had fixed Princess Sarah's pendant, then the Smith would use the Orichalcum to craft Ultima weapon. This had 155 attack, which was 1 less than the reworked Onion Sword, but because it also added plus 15 to all stats, while the Onion Sword only added plus 5, it was able to deal more damage, while also making the equipped character much stronger in general. If a specific job had also reached level 99, then the Legendary Smith rewarded that character with something to enhance the job further, in the form of either a powerful weapon or a piece of armor. This meant every single job in the game received its own ultimate weapon, but none were as powerful as Ultima weapon. In its original incarnation, Final Fantasy V featured numerous tiers of ultimate weapons, but thanks to the addition of a new bonus dungeon in Final Fantasy V Advance called the Seal Temple, almost all of them were superseded by new weapons. Amongst these, however, was a brand new sword called Ultima Weapon, and this had more raw attack power than anything else found in the game. Its method of acquisition also differed in comparison to many of the other new weapons. The majority were found in chests, with a couple also available as drops or steals from specific enemies, but as if to pay tribute to the Ragnarok from the original version, Ultimate Weapon was associated with a monster in a box, and the foe inside was not Shinryu, but Neo Shinryu. Final Fantasy VI Advance introduced the Dragon's Den, and within, players could find some very strong weapons that had been added into this specific version of the game, acquired by defeating certain bosses or opening chests. Other weapons could also be obtained by betting weapons that were previously very strong in the Dragon's Neck Colosseum. However, this version of the game represented the first instance of there being no new weapons added that were more powerful than existing Ultimate weapons. The one thing it did add, however, was the ability to obtain multiple Ultimate weapons, as it was possible to continue playing the game after defeating the final boss. And this was important, as in the original version of Final Fantasy VI, even though Ragnarok and Ultimate Weapon could be stolen from Lady and Rest respectively, there was no real way to make specific use of them. But with the clear file functionality being added that loaded right before the final boss, you could fight Kefka over and over again and stack up as many Ultimate Weapons, Ragnaroks, and by default, Lightbringers as you wanted. For the 20th anniversary of the original Final Fantasy, the developers at Square sought to enhance the game yet again. This saw numerous improvements made to the game's presentation and tweaks were made to gameplay. A brand new dungeon was also added called the Labyrinth of Time, which featured a brand new multifaceted superboss called Chronodia that had 8 separate forms. Chronodia also had an intimate relationship with a brand new ultimate weapon called the Barbarian sword. This sword had only previously featured in Final Fantasy XI as a low-tier greatsword, so there was no specific lineage to suggest any kind of elevation. But should the most powerful form of Chronodia be defeated, then the Barbarian sword was granted as the reward, and it was stronger than even the ultimate weapon at maximum strength without the power diminishment, while also granting plus 18 strength and plus 13 stamina. Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings was quite an unorthodox game in the grand scheme of the franchise, because even though it was a direct continuation of the story from Final Fantasy XII, it was also considered to be a pseudo-sequel. And even though it was considered to be a strategy role-playing game, it also ventured into the realm of real-time strategy. This meant, even though some aspects were retained, such as broader lore concepts and gambits, there were also quite a few changes compared to Final Fantasy XII, was that characters were now much more unique in terms of their progression, which meant they each had specific sets of weapons that only they could wield. For the first time since Final Fantasy X, this saw character-specific ultimate weapons in an original game, as each character was able to wield a weapon that had the same relative strength in comparison to every other. Almost. Kites, for example, was the only character to have a weapon that did not have either 100 attack or magic attack, as the Zeus mace capped out at 90. However, it did allow Kites to attack in 3 separate directions, so there was a boost in that capacity. Attack speed, the other major stat associated with weapons, could also vary greatly, and if looking at raw power, this meant Varn's ultimate weapon was tied at the top with Fran's Sagittarius and Barsh's Excalibur. Varn did, however, have another weapon that was similar to some previous ultimate weapons, such as in 10 and 11, as it was one of those rare weapons that could be powered up. Anatasia was acquired in Chapter 7, and it started off with a modest 80 attack and 40 magic attack. But every time Midlight's Deep was completed, Anatasia gains plus 10 to each of those stats, and after 100 completions of Midlight's Deep, this saw the attack and magic attack boosted all the way up to plus 999. This was a significant upgrade in comparison to any of the other ultimate weapons available in Revenant Wings, and across the entire franchise, it also represented by far the biggest potential gulf to date when compared to other weapons available within that same game. For the 20th anniversary edition of Final Fantasy II, a similar route was taken to Revenant Wings, as despite the original game being all about choice, just like in 12, with the player able to mold their characters however they wanted, the decision was made to introduce a bunch of new weapons that were locked to specific characters, and they were all associated with a new bonus dungeon called the Arcane Sanctuary. Whenever similar bonus content had been added in previous games, access to these new ultimate weapons was often quite straightforward. Either a powerful boss needed to be defeated, or they could simply be stolen, dropped, or found in a chest. There were, of course, a few deviations, such as the ultimate weapon in Final Fantasy V, but even that was still just a monster in a box. Probably the biggest deviation came from the Final Fantasy I 20th Anniversary Edition, as even though the Barbarian sword was obtainable by defeating the most powerful iteration of Chronodia, just getting to that fight was quite difficult due to the puzzle-like nature of the preceding dungeon, and Final Fantasy II decided to take this concept and amp it up to extreme levels. The Arcane Sanctuary, in the nicest terms, was a horrible creation. The dungeon contained multiple flaws, and there was a firm relation with the key term system found in the base game. To obtain just one ultimate weapon, players had to navigate through the dungeon using the correct combination of keywords before then defeating the new superboss, Freakios, to find out if they had actually succeeded in their quest. It meant players were required to invest a considerable amount of time in order to unlock an ultimate weapon for every character, not least because they could have made a slight mistake along the way and ended up with something different from what they expected. The strongest weapon then presented another shift. Ever since the notion of ultimate weapons had been introduced, swords were the focal point. A few other weapons had entered the fray, but more often than not, when there was a standout weapon in terms of raw power, it was a sword. That changed here, however, as the most powerful weapon was now the Gigantaxe, which was exclusive to Guy. It not only featured 199 attack, which was a significant hike up on the second best weapon in the game, but it also granted Guy plus 99 strength and stamina. Ragnarok, which was Firian's weapon, had only the third highest attack, bested by Leon's exclusive spear, the Longinus. After the release of Final Fantasy XII, the man responsible for the intricate gameplay and progression systems, Hiroyuki Ito, was annoyed that players opted to choose an optimal path. He had hoped to see people creating unique classes for their characters, but instead, everyone min-maxed and turned every character into an identical super soldier. To address this, when work commenced on an enhanced version of Final Fantasy XII, which was called the International Zodiac Job System, Ito reworked progression, making players choose a job for each character that they could not change. A job that meant they could only unlock specific licenses and use specific weapons. It was perhaps because of this change that a ton of new weapons were added into the mix. This saw almost every category of weapon gain a new powerful addition, and even though the Zodiac Spear and Tournesol were still strong, they were pushed down in the pecking order by two new ultimate weapons. The first was the Great Trango, a very powerful one-handed sword, and the second was the Seitengrat, a bow that eclipsed the power of every other weapon in the game, and also provided way more utility thanks to its range. To denote this status, both weapons were invisible when equipped, and as per the Zodiac Spear in the original game, both of these weapons were evolved around being found in chests, very rare chests that were reliant on random numbers to find. Of the two, the Seitengrat was the worst in this regard. The weapon had a chance of spawning inside an invisible chest on the air deck of the Sky Ferry, and you could only find the treasure chest by randomly bumping into it. If it did spawn, that's when things got interesting. If you didn't have the diamond armlet equipped, the Seitengrat would never appear. If you did, however, then there was only a 5% chance of the Seitengrat being housed within. But even still, this meant there was only a 0.01% chance of acquiring the weapon each time the deck was entered, assuming you could even find the chest after it spawned. The remake of Final Fantasy IV for the Nintendo DS was approached in a similar manner to the Final Fantasy III remake. This meant there were major changes to the game's presentation, with voice acting even added into the equation, and there were also new enemies, new story sequences, and numerous tweaks were made to weapons. This meant that while the existing ultimate weapons were retained, their power was no longer the same. Cecil's Ragnarok, for example, saw its power decreased from 200 down to 150, and to help provide more balance, Kane's Holy Lance was increased from 109 to 140. But a new ultimate weapon was also introduced, and although it was a holy sword, it was no longer exclusive to Cecil. The Onion Sword could be obtained by offering a red tail to the tail collector found at the Adamant Isle Grotto, but similar to previous Onion-related equipment, it was not strong by default, as there was a caveat around its performance. Instead of having a static attack value, the Onion Sword's attack was instead the equivalent of 2 times of that of the wielder's level. In addition, the Onion Sword also boosted the wielder's strength to a value of 1/3 of the character's level and had a strong accuracy bonus. At maximum level, this meant it eclipsed the power of the Ragnarok, and more importantly, it also eclipsed the power of the Holy Lance, as the Onion Sword could be wielded by both Cecil and Kane. Not long after the release of the Final Fantasy IV Remake, Square Enix went to market with an episodic sequel that was, in its initial form, exclusive to Japanese mobile devices. The availability of the ultimate weapons coincided with the release of the game's final chapter, as this unlocked access to the subterrane of the True Moon, which was a very long and complex dungeon that featured plenty of tough bosses, many of which returned from the main game. This time, however, perhaps because of how much the cast was expanded, weapons were seldom locked to specific characters. The Ragnarok, for example, which featured as the strongest holy sword, could now be equipped by Cecil, Theodore, and Kain. But as with the DS remake, even though it was a very strong weapon, it was no longer the strongest weapon. That mantle was instead reserved for another illusion, as Ultimate Weapon featured as a straight one-handed sword with more raw power. And in addition to Cecil, Theodore and Kain, it could also be wielded by Golbez. This then highlighted the ever-changing views of the developers, as even though Final Fantasy X continued the trend of having ultimate weapons locked to specific characters, that trend did not continue for long. Some games adopted a more open stance, ensuring ultimate weapons were available to all characters, but enhanced versions and remakes often went more rigid, locking new ultimate weapons to specific characters or specific jobs. But in order to see how the concept of ultimate weapons continued to evolve as the franchise continued to grow, starting with Final Fantasy XIII, you'll have to make sure you check out part 3 of this evolutionary series. So make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're immediately informed when the next part is published, which should be within the next month. But if you're watching in the future, you should be able to find a playlist with all of the previous parts contained within. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory and Stephen, who are super special Onion supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.